Hello and welcome to the Air and Cosmos studio, where we are fortunate to have Héloïse Fayet with us today. Hello.
Hello, Xavier.
You are a researcher at the French Institute of International Relations, specializing in military nuclear issues.
Yes, very much so.
Important to specify. We're going to talk a little bit about this general atmosphere in which it is said that France could become the nuclear umbrella of Europe. Maybe other Europeans could use our nuclear weapons. So, first question, what do we have in France in terms of deterrence?
Today, France has two components, so an oceanic component and an airborne component. This represents 4 nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines, which is the oceanic component that can embark 16 M51 missiles. These are intercontinental ballistic missiles that have a range of about 8,000 kilometers. SSBNs have the advantage of being undetectable. And so this is what we call the second strike guarantee. If all nuclear infrastructures in France are destroyed, normally the SSBN can still fire a missile.
There is always at least one
SSBN at sea that is therefore capable of ensuring this permanence of deterrence. And then we also have an airborne component that is divided into 2 branches. On one side you have the strategic air forces. These are 2 squadrons of GUS that carry under their wings the Air Sol Moyenne Portée Améliorée, the French nuclear cruise missile that has a range. You can find quite a few estimates on the internet, but less than 1,000 kilometers. So it means that the Rafale still has to get a little closer to deliver the charge. The French also have a unique nuclear naval air force. And so these are Marine Rafales that are capable of landing on Charles de Gaulle's aircraft carrier and then taking off with also the nuclear missile under the wings. The airborne component is primarily used for strategic signaling. The exercises, operations and maneuvers send a message of determination to the adversary.
Before shooting, it allows to still lower the tension. In terms of power, a single missile from a submarine that carries 16 missiles, what is the order of magnitude of its destructive power?
So it's obviously not public, but because we don't know exactly how many nuclear warheads are under the cover of an M51, we say between 6 and 8 heads each with a power of 100 kilotons. And then the SMPR, we are rather on 300 kilotons, but which is adjustable, so not at the level of American nuclear weapons, like less than 100 kilotons, but which is slightly adjustable, especially to deliver what we call the ultimate warning, which would indeed potentially be this ultimate message. By seeing the opponent before potentially launching the remaining missiles by submarine-launched ballistic missile.
So we have, I'm simplifying, 1 megaton in an M51 300 kilotons in an SMPA compared to the 15 kilotons of Hiroshima.
That's it.
More or less that, yes. So
the damage has increased significantly.
The United States has provided B-61 nuclear bombs to certain European countries. How does this arrangement work?
Today the B-61 is being modernized. It is deployed in several NATO countries, so Germany, the Netherlands, Belgium, Italy and Turkey. And then this bomb can be carried by planes, so F-16s or Tornadoes, and then other models as well, which are also deployed in those same countries. So obviously you actually need the authorization of Supreme Allied Commander Europe, the NATO commander in Europe, to use these nuclear weapons, a commander who is American. And so in the end you need the agreement of the President of the United States, but also obviously the agreement of the host country. And so this plane is part of the air forces of the countries where it is deployed and would be piloted by precisely a pilot of the nationality of a Belgian or German pilot to go drop it over a Russian city. So obviously as part of a constituted raid, because in these cases you need tankers and the suppression of enemy defenses.
Over a Russian city, it remains a strategic bomb, not a tactical one.
So it's considered a tactical bomb, like a tactical nuclear weapon.
So it's more on a battlefield than on a Russian city in this case?
That would depend in this case on the targeting policy. It would also depend on the necessity to use these nuclear weapons. Would it actually be over a battlefield or would it be over a city? It depends on the targeting plans developed in the NATO nuclear planning group, which France does not participate in.
Because it's worth remembering that at the time we had the mobile ground-to-ground nuclear weapon. Our goal was to shoot at the Russians who crossed into West Germany to stop them, not to target Moscow.
Oh no, because anyway, the range was still quite limited for these ground-to-ground systems. So the weapons in the silos could hit a little bit further. However, the systems on Pluto and later Hades were designed to strike, and despite being replacements for sieges, in fact, West Germany or East Germany at the furthest, if there had ever been a Soviet invasion, which explains why we still got rid of it at the end of the Cold War with the reunification of Germany, the integration of Germany into European systems, because it didn't send a very good message to keep this kind of weaponry. It's also designed to prevent nuclear proliferation. These agreements originate from the 1950s to 1960s. At that time, there were thousands more gravity bombs. To prevent Germany and Italy from possessing nuclear weapons, the United States offered to store nuclear weapons in their countries instead. We share the decision-making to launch it. The French were the only ones who didn't adhere to the idea. Given that we have decided to have our own independent deterrence, which we can resolve today.
Thank you, General. A gravity bomb requires getting within a few tenths of a kilometer of the target, which is still dangerous for the carrier. The second problem is that there is no European capability without the Americans pressing the button.
Indeed, there is no European gravity bomb today. So the British we had in the 60s, 70s, 80s, but always with a strong dependence on the United States. France also had some gravity waves in the past, but now they only have cruise missiles.
Is the British Strategic Oceanic Force truly under American dual control as claimed?
No, it's not an American double key. That is to say, it is indeed the British Prime Minister who makes the decision to fire Trident missiles, except that in fact the missiles are partially manufactured in the United States. The British manufacture the nuclear warhead. They also decide, largely in agreement with the Americans, on the targeting plan. They determine their patrol rhythm, and their ballistic missile submarines are not in great condition, having issues with... We saw it with a patrol record of more than 200 days. Imagine the state of the crew after a 200-day patrol where you can't surface. And so the maintenance of the Tridents is done in the United States. So if ever the United States decides to stop this, it is possible that the British will seek to make concessions finally, to find concessions with the United States. Simply so that their oceanic nuclear deterrence continues to operate.
So there is no kill switch, like on the F-35, no, but on the F-35 either?
The F-35, it's also more about maintenance issues. There you go, it's about 30 days, so it's not a direct kill switch. And Donald Trump doesn't need to give his approval either. Every time a NATO plane, contrary to what some French politicians may have said.
Fortunately. And I refer you to the video we made on the subject. Now, the question is, France says it has nuclear weapons, that's for sure, and that its vital interests go beyond its borders.
Absolutely.
What specifically does having nuclear weapons mean in terms of who we are protecting with them?
Well, on the contrary, the problem is that we don't know. It is essential to remember that only the President of the Republic in France has the authority to initiate a nuclear strike, as it is a vital interest that resides solely in their mind. But afterwards, what we know is that this idea of a European dimension of French nuclear deterrence, it has been present in the doctrine since the years 1970. In fact, the 1972 White Paper, it specifies that the French nuclear deterrence, it is made to protect the national territory and its approaches. At the time, it included the Benelux, possibly northern Italy and the West Mon. Because already, at the time, we realized that it is totally illusory to think that the Soviet forces could reach the border between West Germany and East Germany. Without France having to react from that moment, would it be counterproductive to wait for the forces to be at the gates of Strasbourg? And I believe it was President Mitterrand who rightly said that if we ever got there, it's because deterrence had failed. So it clearly meant that nuclear deterrence had to be used before we got to that situation. And so today, as Europe is being built, not necessarily the European Union, but Europe as such, the expansion of NATO, the European Union, the creation of the Eurozone, the strong energy, financial, industrial ties between France and certain European countries, well, yes, we can consider that an attack on the vital interests, for example, of Poland, Finland or the Baltic countries would probably have consequences on the vital French interests. So, is this really what we mean when we talk about the European dimension of vital French interests? It's recognizing that there is potentially an interdependence. Today, this interdependence is acknowledged regarding the United Kingdom. It's the Shakers Declaration of 1995, which was then renewed by the Lancaster House Treaty of 2010, and the treaty that will be renewed, or rather refreshed this summer. It acknowledges that harm to the vital interests of France inevitably harms the vital interests of the United Kingdom, and vice versa. There is a somewhat similar formulation with Germany within the framework of the Élysée Treaty. And there, we are waiting to see if the Nancy Treaty, which will be signed with Poland, so spring-summer 2025, will also include a similar formulation. But the idea today is to reflect on this interconnection of vital interests. Then ask the interested European countries, what does this mean to you? Is it a vital interest? What connection do you see between France, Poland, and Romania? And how can French nuclear deterrence reassure you and better protect you?
Very concretely, there is a lot of bad buzz about political recovery around President Macron's remarks. Who said that? Obviously, there was a question to be asked about the extension of the French nuclear umbrella. Extension equals sharing.
No, exactly. Is this really what we need to keep in mind? The idea here is not at all to reproduce the American model, but to invent a French model. So, for now, there is no question of deploying French nuclear weapons abroad. And in any case, the President of the Republic will always retain the sovereignty of the decision to use nuclear fire. So what you need to understand, in fact, rather than seeing this as a generous proposal on the part of France, in fact, for me, it's rather the opposite. It's that we realize that we have every interest in the Eastern European states being better protected to ensure robust European defense and reduce the risk of attacks on French soil. And that, for that, one of the solutions is indeed nuclear deterrence. But it's not just about that. It also involves strengthening the conventional French presence abroad, especially in the Baltic countries, Romania, where there are already French soldiers, but also why not in Poland? Because when we interact, for example, with Estonians who actually see French soldiers, they see them as a real embodiment precisely of this nuclear deterrence abroad. So it's really important to see this. Not actually focused on nuclear weapons, but with other dimensions, particularly in terms of air defense, sky policing, a conventional force on the ground. Why not one day a deep strike system? It really must represent a whole with nuclear deterrence as the keystone. But obviously it's not about having a briefcase with the button inside that circulates between the 27 capitals of the European Union, nor about selling French nuclear weapons. Moreover, that one, van der Leyen, as we could hear or read, it's really about France's sovereignty over its nuclear weapons, and a reflection on how it could be useful for the defense of Europe, but always keeping a link with France. And that's why, in my opinion, it's even more credible than American nuclear deterrence. Regardless of events in Europe, the United States remains unaffected directly. And that's exactly why today, in fact, Trump, he can, in quotes, abandon the Ukrainians without there being direct consequences on the United States. While we, the French, being on European territory, like the British, in fact, something that happens in the east of Europe, it necessarily has consequences on us. And that's really what, in fact, needs to be developed as a thought.
United States and European vital strategic interests are increasingly decoupled, that's certain. Their willingness to engage, defend, and allow allies to use nuclear weapons on their territory is not guaranteed.
There you have it. We French have always had this doubt. However, there are currently no signs that the Americans want to withdraw their nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. There are even Republicans who say that we should put a little more to be more credible towards Russia. But indeed, when we see the remarks of Donald Trump, one can wonder if he would really be ready to use nuclear force to defend Europe. Whether it's his American nuclear weapons deployed in Europe. But also, let's not forget the American deterrence itself, which in the American doctrine is made to protect the United States and its allies, both in Europe, but also in Asia, notably in South Korea and Japan.
I return to the so-called sharing. Some countries, such as Poland, have expressed their willingness to acquire nuclear weapons through various means. In the absence of a national nuclear weapons program that we have not heard about? But why not like South Korea or other countries if they want to acquire? Can we imagine France requiring some things in 15 years? Well then, that
major upheavals?
Political, etc. But could we imagine that they would buy the Rafale in the F-5 standard? With, at that time, it will no longer be the SNPA, it will be the ASN-4G missile. Could we imagine an extension on the model of what the Americans did with Germany and Belgium? Could France do it with Poland, or even replace the United States and Europe in the field?
So everything is possible in the field of nuclear. So I think what is more likely at first is the deployment of gusts of faces abroad, but without nuclear weapons. Already, for questions, to be used to interoperability, again demonstration, strategic signaling, to be ready and measure. 2. The deployment of French nuclear weapons abroad, it seems unlikely to me, but it is still something that is conceivable. In that case, it would require specific infrastructures. And there precisely, they are currently renovating the Luxeuil base in France to accommodate the future SN4G missile and the Rafale F5. The cost is more than 1 billion euros. So to imagine to build infrastructure abroad, with also therefore the projection of French personnel to secure these weapons, we would be looking at extremely large amounts. And then we would have to imagine a modification of the French nuclear doctrine to have this sharing of the decision. And in my opinion, given that precisely France is quite critical of the American model with this dual key on nuclear weapons, we believe it's unreliable as it would ultimately require a decision from Sarkozy or the United States president. In fact, I don't really see the interest that France would have in doing this for now. So if we are in a timeline, where exactly would we say we are? There are no longer any American nuclear weapons in Europe, and the Russian threat is always stronger. Why not? But it should not come at the expense of strengthening France's own nuclear situation either. And so perhaps, in my opinion, the Allies would be more reassured by a more robust French central deterrence. So why not with a fifth or even a sixth SSBN? A new squadron of Rafale, managing to maintain both the Rafale F3, F4 and then the Rafale F5, having a mix of renovated SMPAR and SN4G, so more nuclear heads in fact. Or an even clearer doctrine on this French protection, this European dimension of French nuclear deterrence. I think the first step will rather be that before the deployment of French nuclear weapons abroad and then buying nuclear weapons from France and thus France losing control over nuclear weapons, that is unthinkable, given that it would be violating, in fact, the non-proliferation nuclear treaty.
Okay, but on the other hand, buying gusts on which we can quickly mount SN4G again, I imagine yes, so that, no, that does not pose a problem, that it's possible.
Yes, it's quite conceivable, and it's even what the Poles, in fact, wanted to do vis-à-vis the Biden administration. They have been asking for a long time, in fact, to be part of NATO's nuclear sharing agreements. So, with B-61s deployed on Polish soil, Trump was against it, Biden wasn't necessarily for it either. But what the Poles are trying to do precisely is to buy dual-capable aircraft that can carry nuclear weapons under their wings, but without necessarily having the nuclear weapon at home.
So concretely, this means that even in the most extreme politicized delusions, again, at the very worst of him sharing, it's not sharing. This means that these Eastern European countries are potentially buying weapons from us and that potentially we are ready to have an A400M takeoff. 3 hours later, our allies could possess usable nuclear weapons, purchased from us along with the accompanying doctrinal evolution.
So I think in this case, in fact, we would rather still be on storing French nuclear weapons in bases. Again, in fact, selling nuclear weapons to another country, it's not possible from the non-proliferation treaty. If a French nuclear weapon exists, it will remain under the control of the President of the Republic, also embodied by a very strong governmental control, the gendarmerie, the security of nuclear weapons, this kind of precautions. And so it's very important that French policymakers keep this in mind, because even if in France we don't have a perfect parliamentary democracy, a deputy speaking on a defense issue may not face significant consequences. On the other hand, in parliamentary democracies like the Scandinavian countries or Germany, hearing a far-left or far-right deputy, who questions this part of the French nuclear doctrine? Who accuses President Macron of wanting to precisely transmit to sell French nuclear weapons when this is not the case? Well, it actually jeopardizes the credibility of French nuclear deterrence, the contribution of deterrence to the defense of Europe. In my opinion, French politicians have a real responsibility on this subject. The President of the Republic always makes the final decision. In 2 years, Macron's successor, regardless of gender, may not be as supportive of Europe, defense and NATO. So it's also a responsibility as a citizen to have defense issues in mind when voting.
And on the other hand, if we look at the Russians, what about them? Do they forbid themselves from getting closer to the countries of Europe? Or do they continue to stay on their own territory?
So, at first, in fact, the Russians were very critical of NATO's nuclear sharing arrangements. It was said to violate the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, but this is not true. In fact, they completely abandoned that policy a year or two ago. And they decided, according to them, to mirror these NATO nuclear sharing arrangements by deploying nuclear weapons in Leningrad. But that's part of Russian territory, and especially in Belarus, with a very clear strengthening of ties between Russia and Belarus. We witnessed this in the revised Russian nuclear deterrence doctrine, published in November 2024. Attacks against Belarus are considered attacks against Russian territory. And so indeed there are satellite images, studies that potentially show the presence of nuclear weapons in Belarus. This contravenes, let's say, the spirit of relations between NATO and Russia, but which have in fact already been severely undermined
by the invasion
of Ukraine. However, it can be argued that it does not violate the nuclear non-proliferation treaty, given that the Russians still have exclusive control of these nuclear weapons in Belarus.
So, by symmetry, if we also moved nuclear weapons closer to Poland, it would not be an aggression on our part. It would simply be doing what the Russians have done in Belarus.
Yes, we can consider anyway that NATO is a military alliance, that Poland is a sovereign state. And so if Poland wants to have NATO nuclear weapons on its territory and the North Atlantic Council agrees, well, that would be quite feasible. Except that, obviously, given Donald Trump's policy of getting closer to Russia, regrettably, Poland's aspiration to possess nuclear weapons under NATO's nuclear sharing program appears to be fading.
Heloise, a big thank you.
Thank you, Xavier.
We hope you enjoyed it, and we'll see you soon at Recosmos Studio.